Hi, this is Paul. I just have to say that the YouTube algorithm let me down dramatically because there was a video of Tom Holland on Unbelievable with Andrew Allerton. I've never heard of this guy. And it was on YouTube for 7 days. And I heard about it because someone on the Bridges of Meaning Discord wrote, I can't believe Paul hasn't made a comment about this Tom Holland video. And rightly so. So now we're going to get a comment. We're going to get a lot of comments. I've never heard of Andrew Allerton. Apparently, he's a British Christian with an advanced degree in the Bible or something, and he writes books. And so he's on there talking to Tom Holland, and he wrote a book that Tom Holland wrote a blurb for, an appreciative blurb for, that was right on the cover. And the other person on the cover was Bear Grylls. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And so right away, you can tell that this book is pitched to much more of a church audience, an audience of regular people who go about regular things. And he's going to talk here a little bit about relevance. Well, we might as well jump into it and get going.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. It's great to be on the show today. Glad you framed it as a friendly conversation with Tom, who I greatly respect as well, his work. Yeah, the book is... it is a complement to the Bible course. I think it's doing something a bit different. The Bible course was really designed to help people see how the different books and characters in the Bible fit together. The book does some of that, but I think the real thrust of it is, is the Bible coherent? But even more importantly, is it still relevant? And I think, well...
Now the relevance question, wow. Once you use that word can be a trigger word in certain places. Now, I like that. Well, they're talking about sense making. What do we mean by sense making? Well, the last video, you'd see a flurry of videos in the last few days, and I know some people complained when I let out a 20-minute one and then I let in an hour one. It all just happens to be in terms of the time I have available for video making and the thoughts that I have, because again, I'm thinking out loud basically as we go. Sense making. Okay, so in the last video I talked about this way of navigating that we do sort of between, let's say, data and narrative. All right, let's use it that way instead of facts, because facts are so situated in modernity, and in some ways, this video too, we're moving out of modernity, and there are tells and signs in this video as well with all of the people involved. But what we always do with sort of narrative and data is we're always comparing them, and we stretch the narrative according to the data, and we view the data through the narrative. And this back and forth is basically sense making. That's how we make sense of the world. Now, we might have, Jordan Peterson calls it a transformation. Christianity might call it a conversion, when for some person the data forces a dramatic change in narrative. Okay? And if you think about a human being as basically an autobiographer, a self-autobiographer, but it's in the same way that an autobiographer didn't invent the language that autobiographer uses, and in the way that we don't know ourselves besides seeing ourselves through other people. That shows you the limitations of an autobiographer. And a biographer looks at the person through a different lens. And if you've read many biographies and autobiographies of the same person, it's a very telling thing. And often the biographies are written after the autobiography. And some autobiographies are not really autobiographies because there's a ghostwriter, or someone else is basically writing a biography that somehow the author sort of signs his or her name on. So the relevance thing is about data and narrative, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And of course, as we're seeing in the culture right now, because of the proliferation of media sources, and again, I'm thinking about, oh gosh, could I find it right now? Could I play it right now? Do I need to? his comment in the question and answer about, are you concerned that social media is creating these echo chambers? And basically the idea of that is all of the data that we get through media, whether mass media or social media, is already filtered, because the person that puts it out on media, it's already passed through their filter, their relevance realization, and now they're putting it out in the media. So we use this word relevance to deal with the interchange between the data and the narrative. So that's what we're involved with. And obviously as a Christian, and part of Christianity is the promotion, the spread, evangelization, the spreading of the good news. And Justin Brierley and Glenn Scrivener, those two people have poked and prodded Tom Holland. Tom, do you really believe now? And we have to talk about those categories. And, I know some of that will really disturb some people, but the categories have in some ways been disrupted, and we have to deal with the disruption. And so we sort of have to, but we have to deal with the disruption on various levels, because some people are cognizant of the disruption and other people are innocent of the disruption. And if you're a Christian minister like myself, you have to deal with people on both sides of that line. So
the reason that matters, I think, is because culturally, perhaps previously, we were more concerned with, is the Bible reliable? And I think the conversation shifted. I think more and more people would almost shrug their shoulders and say, well, even if you can prove that it's reliable, why would I bother with it? There's plenty of other things to watch on Netflix. Why is it still relevant? What's the relevance?
So there's little tells of past modernity, even if it's reliable. And I've made this statement many times, and people have made it to me. Well, even if for some reason that dude 2,000 years ago walked out of the grave, and even if you had the heel print and it was there behind glass in the Vatican or in some place in Ethiopia somewhere, even then, so what? And gosh, the video I would have likely dealt with today is Jonathan Peugeot's video on universal history, because that video, maybe just because they're both in my mind right now, that video is a very interesting video to be in conversation with this video, because the universal history video, if you sort of scratch at that, you begin to ask deep questions about, well, why does everything go back to Troy? Well, why does everything go back to Jerusalem and the Jews? Just because they wrote down things first? Well, that early writings certainly have something to do with it, because those early narratives framed data and shaped data, but sort of in the Jordan Peterson Darwinian truth discernment method, it's also the case that, Gilgamesh is a very ancient story, but it hasn't quite colonized in the same way. And of course, Tom Holland will weigh in with the Persians, but something is going on over time, because we're always checking between the data and the narrative. Something is going on there, and our, we sort of know that our grasp of the data relies on the narrative, but the narrative is always updated by the data, and this isn't just individually, this is communally. So for regular people, now this guy did apparently some course, and I'm sure some of you from the UK in the comment section will say, here's the course and this is what it means. And please leave those comments, because I'm kind of curious about it, because this is sort of a UK conversation because of the people that are here. But so this is let's call him a churchman. What do I mean by that? This is someone who works in the church, someone who focuses in the church. And if you're a pastor, you get used to having to deal with multiple layers. And so for many people, you're a popularizer. You're trying to take these things and make them available and helpful to as broad a group of people as possible.
The book in that sense is coherence and relevance. And so what I try to do is move through the arc of the biblical narrative from the origin story in Genesis right through to the sort of hope scenes in the end of Revelation.
And this is a very common church move. It's a common preacher move. It's a common pastor move. And the doing this job and writing books like this, it's endless because you just have to keep doing it because people keep changing and it keeps needing to be updated. And that's the work of the church and the work of theology.
But to tag to each of those major biblical episodes a human condition, a felt need, something demonstrating effectively that the Bible still, throughout its story, speaks to our story, its relevance.
Now, this gets into the question of the data, because the data isn't just some YouTube video of apologetics. The data is, this is how my mother is, and my mother got cancer, or my job is dull, or I haven't been able to find a wife, or my husband cheated on me, or, I mean, all of that is data. Data is constantly coming at us. And again, go back to Jordan Peterson's Sam Harris conversation. The big point Jordan Peterson was trying to make to Sam Harris in that video was there's too much data, and so you need a filter. And Jordan Peterson, from the psychological perspective and from the philosophical perspective, looks at Kant, looks at Hegel, and says, well, we are filtering it. And this filter is biological. This filter is developmental. This filter has been built in us through generations and generations and generations. This filter is necessary, but in some ways, to throw Brett Weinstein on the top, the culture narrative, because you don't have a human being without a culture, the filter is also cultural, and the filter is also a storyverse. And right away, people are, again, you need a first draft. You need a first draft, and you absorb that first draft. And depending on your education is a big producer of first drafts in people. But parents are big producers of first drafts in people. And they have everything to do with value. So again, if you go back to the beginning, the first question in Jordan Peterson's question and answer, or you look at Sevilla King's work on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, values an incredible deal, because those values are part of that narrative filter, because the values get embedded in the narrative. And so, again, the filter is, the narrative is filtering the data and shaping the data, but the data is also shaping the narrative and therefore the filter. And it's an ongoing back and forth process. All right. And that's why people change. And that's why churches are around, because in many ways, churches are keepers of a communal narrative that it's held by the people. And so it's always changing and moving and growing. And so, a preacher or a leader or a writer or someone like that is a big piece in, managing this narrative together. And this is sense making. That's sort of a shorthand word about it. Oh, it's getting to be summer in Sacramento. I got to turn on my fan
for today. So that was what I took on, and that's the book in its essence.
Yeah, it's interesting you say the conversation has changed in that way. I think I would agree entirely.
Which will be interesting for Justin's show, because in many ways, I've been listening to Justin's ever since Unbelievable went into podcast form. I was very early into podcasts. I remember when I first started downloading podcasts and playing them on an MP3 player, and then had a smartphone. I mean, when the smartphone came, that was incredible. But even before then, I was playing it on my computer. And I was playing Unbelievable because I was very interested in the conversations that he was holding in the apologetics conversation. But that's the milieu that Unbelievable came up in, and really, where Justin paid his dues in this area, and why, frankly, he's just so darn good at it.
And it's interesting to see that there are a lot of contemporary, quite secular thinkers like Jordan Peterson suddenly looking at the Bible, not particularly.
And Justin would love to get Jordan on his program, and I hope he succeeds. I mean, I have my wish list of people I want to see talk to each other too, and I think Justin is so good at what he does. He really is, and so he, I hope he gets all the gets he can.
asking, can I, is it literally true? But saying, is it useful?
There's that word. Is it literally? And we're going to have to, again, that's a word we really have to come to terms with and grab that sucker and pin it down, because it's literally has sort of been the Loki of the conversation, because it just causes all sorts of mischief.
Is can it speak to today's culture? So I think you're tapping in on something that seems to have emerged a bit recently in our culture.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And Esther says yes.
And I think, somebody like Jordan Peterson, picking up on the Bible, at least as an archetypal narrative, something that profoundly makes sense of who we are.
Arche, tupos. I'm so embarrassed by the fact that I didn't deconstruct that silly word into Greek earlier.
Almost, not wanting to engage really in the particular questions around, is it actually true? There's
another one of these funny words. Actually true. We're at some point we have to stop speaking modernism.
Does it map onto historical events?
Map is a better word.
But simply recognizing, almost regardless of that, it's profoundly useful. And I think
now we're into pragmatic truth. Now we're all pragmatists, aren't we?
Deep concern, and we'll probably pick up on this, but a deep concern around what happens when we ditch that narrative. What else have we got in the locker that can safeguard human flourishing and society? And so I think you're right.
So there's the anxiety. And again, as modernity was really coming up, people realized there were all sorts of sunk costs in Christianity, and so they wanted to save it. And so you have all sorts of attempts to try to save Christianity. You've got Schleiermacher, you've got Bultmann, you've got all of this modernist attempt to sort of save it. You've got Kant in many ways. You've got all of these attempts to save it and integrate it to the system. Now, I should. Oh gosh. All right, now I got two videos open at the same time, and part of me is like, you're going to do it, Vanderclay. You're going to be making commentaries on two videos at once, and you're already releasing too many videos, and you're just wearing out the people who are being very gracious to listen to you, and it's just over the top. I mean, even Rick said to me today, I only have so much time in the day to listen to videos. And then Warren confessed that he was watching videos of some guy out of Hurricane, Utah, who's pulling silly people who try to go off-roading in a Prius out of a ditch. And Rick was telling me about other videos he saw. So I know I'm in YouTube land, and I know y'all have a short attention span, but I'm just going to keep making these videos whether anybody watches them or not. That's just the truth. I told Rick I need a 12-step program. Maybe it's true. Anyway, where was I? I distract myself. That's why I don't do this. Universal history. So this question about, let's work on the language a little bit. How narrative and physicality relate to each other. Because physicality is one aspect of data. And narrative is, dyslexic, I'm looking at two cameras here. Narrative is, in many ways, the way we appropriate the data. It's how we have to appropriate the data. And so, now the physicality is one aspect, but as anybody who deals self-consciously with human relationships knows, physicality is an integral part of the data, but it's one aspect of the data. Let's think about, how many. The easiest illustration is, for a while there was all kinds of ministers who were getting kicked out of the ministry because they had an emotional affair. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, it means that they sort of started having a crush on someone in their church that wasn't usually their wife. And they sort of started getting obsessed with this person. And maybe they sent them notes, or maybe they just paid too much attention, and everyone else in church got nervous and looked at them and said, can't have this, you're done. And, the couple might say, we haven't done anything. Okay. Right there. You've got a narrative and you've got a pattern. All right. So you've got a narrative and you've got a pattern and you've got data. Well, in a case like that, I'm not saying churches shouldn't watch these things. I'm just saying physicality is a part of the story, and a lot of what we're trying to do is figure out how physicality enters into the story. And so, why did I pull up this video with Peugeot on universal history? Because sort of what you have in that video is the remnants of what we've been doing. I'm gonna go for 2 hours. I'm not even gonna get to this video that I want to talk about. I tell you, I'm an addict. Okay, so we're going to work on Tom Holland's book list. The Discarded Image. As if poor Tom Holland doesn't have enough to do. The dude has another book out. Tom Holland, even if he writes the introduction, I buy the book. I'm an addict in buying books too, anyway. So, C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image. Right away, in my first conversation with Byrne Power, we were talking about C.S. Lewis, and Byrne said, my favorite C.S. Lewis book is one nobody's read. Which one is that? The Discarded Image. I hadn't read it. I've read it. It's not an audiobook. It's vitally important. Why? Because what Lewis nicely demonstrates is how the medieval world eventually worked to absorb the classical world into Christianity. And in some ways, the Protestant Reformation is the most ironic fruit of that process, because I think I've got Transubstantiation over there, Brett Sockold's book. In a lot of ways, the Protestant Reformation sort of kicks off both sort of splits the world in a different way, because there's a deep skepticism about the physicality, the efficacy of the physicality of the Roman Catholic ritual. Let's say it that way. And what happens is that there's a psychologization of Christianity in the Protestant Reformation. It's not complete, it's partial, but that will continue. And so, but what that does is sort of frees up physicality. And especially with the Enlightenment, it frees up sort of a whole new church to develop, which is sort of in the shadow of the Christian church. And that's where you get, the quest for certainty through empiricism and rationality, two more forms of data that are going to shape the narrative. And there's a deep skepticism about the mapping of the great unified history story onto physicality, and especially about, in some ways, the relationships between words and physicality. Hocus pocus, right? That's from the Mass. It's from the Latin Mass. It's a mockery of the Latin Mass in a way. And it's about magic, and it's about the host changing. And, it's not... So, part of the reason I'm Tom Holland's biggest fan is because Tom Holland is a public figure who, more than just about anybody else, is talking about this stuff out loud, honestly, in ways that, annoying Christians like myself and Justin Brierley and Glenn Scrivener just find endlessly fascinating and keep wanting to poke at. And maybe we should, examine ourselves with respect to that inordinate desire. Yeah. So, when you look at what Peugeot is doing, what Peugeot is really doing is trying to pick up where Lewis left off. And the new atheists, in a sense, say, throw away the story. All that universal history is BS. And, well, but maybe we can't live without it, because it's narrative and data. And those two things are always going back and forth. And I know, with the Vervaeke side of the conversation, that's going to keep me honest. Well, you did Vanderklay, the narrative. How real is narrative? Real enough to make people do just about everything they do. It's that real. And there's a sense that happens in the Protestant Reformation that if the data, physicality, and the narrative get too far apart, well, then you've got real problems, because, and this is right where the preacher here, right where normal people who aren't sitting here thinking about philosophy, they've got to keep it together. And yeah, there's a lot of people that have a lot of fantasies about things. And so, oh gosh, see, this is what happens when I off the cuff my videos instead of sitting down and making a PowerPoint, because then I start pulling up things because my silly ADHD mind just starts processing things. But I am who I am, and that's all that I am. So then we have the kinds of things like Tara Isabel Burton is writing about, and that's sense making. That's people now playing with narratives and playing further narratives. And of course Jonathan Peugeot's going to come in and say, hey, wait a minute, that narrative you're playing with, that's actually derivative of other narratives, and I can use my sort of philological symbolism to connect it to other things. And the philologist, who's the other person Jonathan Peugeot is talking to, is saying, yeah, in fact, the language is connected to other things. And now we're sort of at these archetypos. Arche are both first and highest and governing and ruling. Greek word archetypos, type. This strange substitutions that we do. And I know some of you are going to say, yeah, well, Vanderklay, you're always leaving your projects half done. And that's true. But you got to get back to this book. And I stalled at this book because right with the chapter that he starts talking about, well, Adam is a tupos. Adam is a type. Well, you're saying Adam isn't real? Adam isn't physical? And really underlying this entire conversation, which maybe I'll never get to because I'll run out of time. It's 2:50 already, and I don't have all day. We're asking about what is the relationship between type and physis, nature, physics, physical. What's the relationship between those things? And, well, it's running through us. But is it bigger than us? Yeah, it's us communally. And it's us historically, and it's our representations. And of course, that's when Jordan Peterson starts getting spooky and nervous and saying things like, oh, how far can this go? And Tom Holland says, well, I can't answer that question, but inside of me, it's sure a lot more fun if I lean into the story than... See, the thing is, if you don't have like that big universal story, if you're not working on that, well, then what do you have? There's always a narrative. There's always a story. You can't live without one. And I mean that physically. You will kill yourself unless you have a good narrative. Psychologically, the devil comes and tempts Jesus to turn stones into bread. Man shall not live by bread alone. Man lives on the story. If you don't have a story, you will kill yourself. It's called nihilism. And it's how many people Jordan Peterson saved from by sort of giving them a little tiny infusion of story through the YouTube. The YouTube is sort of the Jordan Peterson meaning syringe. And that's what's happened. And it's still happening because you can't live without your story. Okay, back to the video.
Right, there's even people, would refer to themselves as Christian atheists, right? That, they're not necessarily believing in.
Okay, and now we're back at, so if you, see, this is why I should plan. Because if you go, now we got to find it. Say Paul, this is why Paul needs to make remixed. Oh, no, I can't see it up here. All right, there it is. Nope, still not on top. Sorry, audio listeners. Who are the religiously remixed? And what is a religion anyway? And of course, because America seems to have a little bit of post-traumatic reactivity to the 1980s and Jerry Falwell in 2000, Tara Isabel Burton goes into, hey, people be mixing here. People be mixing and not just hip-hop and Freddie on the Freddie and Paul show. You got to be deeply into the Paul Vanderklay universe to under that. Only those of you who watch the original programming, because before Paul did Jordan Peterson commentaries, there was the Freddie and Paul show. And Freddie is always telling me, Paul, you got to promote our show. So there you go, Freddie. I'm promoting the show.
In a metaphysical God, but really seeing the value of Christianity. And I really respect that. I think, I wrote the book partly as an invitation to those who are really not persuaded by the metaphysical commitments of Christianity. And one of the things I say early on, and I sort of drew this from Charles Taylor, who has this nice line about, almost needing a new kind of apologetics that says, just try it on for size, see if it fits and makes sense of you. And I quite like.
And that's exactly what Tara Isabel Burton is writing about in Strange Rights. There's someone you could get on your show, Justin. That would be an interesting program.
That idea. And so I want.
Now I'm calling out just like Freddie does to Tigriz and all the other rappers that I don't even know.
To write something that was pretty accessible for popular culture and something you could just say, you don't have to sign up to the Bible to give it a try, see if it.
Sign up to the Bible. Here's this belief and profession and commitment and identity. Well, we're nervous about that because we don't want to be like one of those. And that just shows you, and I'm sure it's way worse in the UK where numbers of Christians are quite a bit lower than in the United States. But I don't want to have my reputation be like one of those people out there who believes the Bible is the word of God and believe Jesus rose from the dead. And, fundamentalist, Dread Pirate Roberts fundamentalist will get a calling in this video.
Fits and makes sense of you.
Great stuff. Well, really looking forward to the conversation.
Great stuff. Come on, Justin, put a little more oomph in that.
Today with Tom Holland, who's our other guest. Tom, you've had a chance to read and indeed endorse Andrew's book. So what did you make of it? Presumably it was a good endorsement, because I think it even made the cover of the book.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I wouldn't give an endorsement if I didn't like it. and if I gave a negative endorsement, I'm sure it wouldn't appear on the cover. So
and this is one of the qualities I really appreciate about Tom Holland. Yeah, and I might embarrass Tom because I'm such a big fan, but he's honest. He's honest. He tells us what he thinks, and that's just refreshing.
So yes, I think you can take it as read that I enjoyed it very much.
What was your overall kind of takeaway from the book when you read it? Did you find it, yourself helpful in terms of putting things together in a way, I don't know, or certainly I suppose for people who aren't so familiar with the Bible? I guess there's a lot of people who just don't have, in a sense, and I'm talking about Christians here as much as anyone, a real sense of the way it all hangs together and the way it has been accessed by generations past. So I guess you think whether you're Christian or not, it's important to understand that, Tom.
Which before I let Tom speak, what Justin just went into is really important, because this narrative and the first draft of the narrative, I mean, it's amazing how far human beings can go even on a crappy first draft. That's astounding. But and the individual first draft of the map is deeply connected to the other first drafts. And again, back to Jordan Peterson's conversation with Michael Shermer, when Peterson basically says, hey, for a lot of people, we just borrow those first draft maps from other people, and even if our sketching of it is really lousy, if it's a decent cultural draft, it will actually take us someplace. I mean, these narratives and these drafts are that influential and that critical.
Well, one of the things that that I've learnt to appreciate and enjoy since writing about the history of Christianity and kind of immersing myself in it is to look at the Bible not just as source material for what may or may not have happened.
The physical layer.
Over the periods that the Bible describes, but also to really to read it as a holy text, which is something that I hadn't been doing since childhood.
And I would love to hear what do we mean when we say that? I read it as a holy text. Now there's a performative aspect to that. I read it every day at a certain hour. I use the daily office. And that, I think part of modernity and part of the legacy of the Protestant Reformation is we too quickly dismiss the performative. And perhaps that's one way of getting at this big sea change that we see happening before us. So to read it as a sacred text. And 40 years ago, back when I was reading liberation theology, you always got into praxis, which is sort of, embodied. I mean, we've been playing around with this stuff in theology at the loose ends of theology for a while. And, so reading it as a sacred text. Okay. So I read it repeatedly. I give it some authority. That's very Protestant. The Catholics, of course, see it as authoritative, but it's psychological. So, and I love where he goes with this, because we're going to talk about the inside and the outside, and C.S. Lewis has that in terms of seeing the beam or seeing through the beam in his essay on Reflections from a Woodshed. And John Vervaeke will talk about it in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, where he talks about Christianity and Buddhism. It's one thing to be inside the religion. And you see, when Tom Holland realizes that in order to write about these things, and this is always so hard because there's only one of us, because on one hand, you can't, there's the question of whether anybody who grows up in North America can actually be a Buddhist. Although everybody's taking on all this Buddhist stuff. It's all the mixing, and Tara Isabel Burton is writing about that. So, and so just for a little taste, I'm going to step into and see through the beam of light instead of I'm going to look at the beam of light. And of course, for Lewis, that was a huge part of, there was a huge part of his conversion, because he realized it was just much better living in the beam of light rather than looking at it. And Tom Holland says nearly the same thing.
And so Andrew's guide to the Bible from a believer's point of view is one that is kind of very accessible and not in any way reductive, which I often find that quite a lot of Christian commentaries on the Bible overtly can be quite reductive.
Let's talk about commentary, shall we? I've got a whole wall behind me of commentaries. And now, oh gosh, let's pick see, I have so many evangelical commentaries too, but you pick something which is a little bit more maybe something like this. Part of what happened with biblical commentaries, and part of why Jonathan Pageau has no kind words for modernist readers of the Bible, is because in some ways we had to look at the Bible and not through it. And so this then becomes this, and so what happens is you start, here's Cosman, and here's Marcus Barth, and of course Barth, his father is a famous theologian, Karl Barth, and so what happens is you have this game, and as I think one of my biblical studies professors in seminary said, American scholars are always looking over their right shoulder, and English scholars are always looking over their left shoulder. So some of my favorite biblical commentators have been, F.F. Bruce. Oh, here's an old one. The height of modernism. But there was value in that, and I know some of you out there would say, no, there's no value in it, but I always found value in it. But then, of course, good old Brevard Childs comes along, and in a lot of ways, Brevard Childs sort of haunts this conversation because, well, reading the canon as canon and not just chopping it up, because that just got so darn boring. And then you've got other guys who are, skirting things like Walter Brueggemann. And some of you always want to know what books are behind me. Oh, here's Gerhardus Voss. And this is the whole, Voss, Herman Bavinck, Abram Kuyper. They were wrestling with these kinds of questions 100 years ago. And so, we've been doing a lot of this. And the book, the Bible, is a book that we can study as such, but the kinds of questions that these people are asking is, can the Bible be used as sort of something that governs this narrative that is going to affect the way we filter the data? And someone will say, "Oh, that's dangerous." Oh, yes, it is. But you've already got a narrative that is filtering the data. And part of what's happening now with the internet is that, rebel wisdom is all over the place with this sense-making stuff. Well, that's what we're talking about, the relationship between these two things. And so Tom Holland says, take a walk on the wild side. Let's start reading it in this way, and let's see what happens. Oh. Aimed
at the general order. There's kind of slight Sunday school teacher quality to it.
Yeah.
And Andrews absolutely does not have that. So I enjoyed that.
And my guess, based on what I said about the commentaries, is that if a lot of the biblical commentaries that I have coming out of the UK, people like N.T. Wright, okay, he's sort of the newest, but F.F. Bruce, Ralph Martin, just pulling some. See, of course, the Dutchmen, Ritterboss, the Dutchmen are dealing with their own questions. Of course, you've got the Germans up there too, and their translations, their commentaries gets translated. So, to what degree has the church always been looking over its left shoulder? And, well, I guess it's hard to keep your eye on the road when you keep looking over your left shoulder or your right shoulder.
That very much.
I was going to say, obviously, it'll be interesting to come into that in the conversation, you know, how you do approach the Bible now, how your recent experiences and the way you've been engaging with the Christian story has sort of shaped the way you now perceive and take on Scripture.
He's getting into personal business.
Talk to us briefly, though, about your own recent book. I'm holding it up for the camera here as well. This is Revolutionary. Who was Jesus? Why does he still matter? This was actually a collection of essays, and you sort of formed the introduction to them. Give a sense of what this one was about, Tom.
Well, as
Big letters, edited by Tom Holland. Everybody else in the book must have a smaller name.
the title implies, it's about Jesus as the fountainhead of revolution, which I was very happy to put my name to. I didn't choose the people who contributed to the book. Who
did? Now I'm curious.
But I was very, very happy to see the range that they had. So obviously there are believing Christians, there are Christians from the left, there are Christians from the right, Christians from various denominations. There's also Jewish, Muslim intellectuals writing about it, and there are agnostics and atheists. So I think the range of voices in that book is tribute.
Who edited this video? Keep the picture on Tom. I mean, this is why I don't edit videos. You just get the whole thing all at once.
To the core argument that the figure of Jesus, whether you are talking about him as the Son of God, as someone who actually lived, or simply as a literary figure, is
okay, Son of God, and this is where modernity, the high water mark of modernity, didn't quite swallow God, Nietzsche notwithstanding. Although, all through this video, I have to keep asking myself, and okay, what are we meaning by that word? I'll say, oh, see, Vanderclay, it's all the thinking that you've done. It's put you in hot water. Yeah, well, as G.K. Chesterton says, I like getting into hot water. It makes me clean. Because we still use the word as if Nietzsche never said what he said and it wasn't heard.
Of seismic importance in the way that the history of the world has evolved over the past 2,000 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way
he's so nonchalant with some of these transitions. Yeah, absolutely.
You begin your introductory piece to it, where you start talking about his coming was foretold by prophecy, his birth heralded by miracles. Only narrowly did he escape a massacre of the innocents, so on and so forth. All sounds like it's leading up to Jesus. Of course, it's actually Augustus Caesar. And you make the point very well that you lead us on.
And they say pastors lie.
I have to confess, you had me there, Tom. I have to confess, when I read it, I was taken in hook, line, and sinker on that. I thought it was brilliant.
But the point being, in a way, that
And this is sort of where, we really have to deal with the universal story. And Peugeot and, why can't I remember the other dude's name? Richard Rohlin, Rohlin, not Richard Rohr, as John Van Donk would love me to be talking about Richard Rohr. Maybe that'll come. Who knows? I've seen how many pastors have Richard Rohr crushes in my career. Peugeot nicely in that video makes the comment that, and I've felt this way for a long time, I can get myself in so much trouble. Because the truth is, especially with the breadth of the audience of this channel, which thankfully isn't that large, almost anything I say is going to trigger somebody, and that's how you know something is important. But, as Peugeot said, the idea that Christianity gets ideas and a range of ideas and types of ideas from other places shouldn't scare you at all. And that's Lewis's position too. So, that's why Lewis is so helpful in this, because the more I do in this, Lewis just ran these circuits 70 years ago. And we're following in his metaphysical, metaphorical footprints. So,
no, there were these messianic divine almost figures, but the point you make in your introduction is, but none of them really changed the status quo in the way that this particular figure did, Jesus.
Okay, and this is where you have the data, the physical data, and then the broader storyverse. And of course, there's just overlapping maps of this communal storyverse, this narrative, again, that is always filtering the data, but the data is always shaping it. And of course, on this one layer, as Tom Holland, and again, thank you, Richard, or Rob, sorry. Thank you, Rob, for donating your copy of Dominion to me. I keep the physical book mostly for a prop, because I always read it on Kindle and audiobook. So, and I'm even using a quote from Dominion in my Sunday sermon this week.
And in that sense, do you see the Bible itself as having that kind of an import? I mean, in as much as that has been the medium by which we have seen that revolution take place.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible is easily the most influential book that's ever been written, and not least is it influential in the way that it kind of establishes the idea that a book can have that weight and that status. So the idea that scripture properly is scripture, that it offers a guide to the purposes of God and a way to live in a single package, is not remotely a given. And in fact, it takes Christians and Jews a fair amount of time to arrive at a kind of sense of what we would call the Bible, because to begin with, ta biblia, it's plural, it's a collection of books. And so that idea we have now of the Bible as the good book is in itself a kind of massive statement about just how revolutionary and seismic the influence of the Bible is. And in a sense, I think certainly in the West, but you could also, I think that the way that Muslims regard the Quran, I mean, in a sense, the heft that Muslims give to the Quran is even greater than Christians give to the Bible. Yeah.
And that's true. But and this is where you get into fundamentalism. If you look at Mormonism, Islam, and certain branches of Christian fundamentalism, the way that they're not just, I mean, Tom just basically said more than, that's like the lowest resolution value comparison. But the distinctive ways in which the scriptures work differently are vitally important. And so a conversation like this is sort of a calibration of those issues.
That sense of scripture is something that Jews, Christians and Muslims all have. And that idea of it begins with really what Christians call the Old Testament. I mean, that kind of sense of Hebrew scripture as it has emerged and evolved. And it's the process of change over the course of the years isn't just in terms of the texts, isn't just what people have decided is canonical, but how they have understood those canons, the very principle of a canon.
And often, my last video I talked about Reformed hermeneutics, and that's what we're getting at. And whereas, I can pull Report 44, Christian Reformed Church, 1973. Boy, a lot of stuff got done at that synod. Synods used to be 2 weeks long, that one. Principles of Reformed hermeneutics. Howard Marshall, fun little book on biblical infallibility that I picked up in seminary. The Bible Made Impossible by not by a sociologist. Oh, now I've got to lower that window if I want you to be able to see, by a sociologist, Christian Smith, as he himself wrestles through that. He teaches now at Notre Dame. And that's, in many ways, when we get to these questions, these hot-button questions like same-sex marriage and women's ordination and where politics and religion intersect, it's at that level that these are the conversations we need to be having. And about, okay, what is the Bible? How are we to live with it? How are we to regard it? And these are the conversations that churches are terrified of. But not having the conversation isn't helping anyone, because people are making up their minds and going out on their own anyway. And so I got to refill my cup.
And so I think that, the very basis of the conversation we're having today, the idea that, well, this book has been the foundation of an entire civilization. It may be less so now. Does that matter?
Jordan Peterson.
I mean, that in itself is the measure of how colossally influential what we call now the Bible has been.
Yeah. I mean...
Yeah. Like, yeah, that's a really great answer. Justin's cracking me up in this video.
In terms of the way your understanding of the Bible has developed, Andrew, I'm guessing you perhaps were raised in some kind of Christian context, but has your own appreciation, I suppose.
You mean, Justin, you didn't spend 2 hours? I yell at Justin and I kid, yell at Justin and Glenn and pestering poor Tom Holland. And, anybody who comes on my channel, I ask them to drag their guts out for a half hour before I even talk about whatever they want to talk about.
Of the Bible and the way it has shaped our culture changed in that time that you've been engaging with it as a Christian?
Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? Because I was brought up on the Bible, in the sense that my parents read it to me, and I hope my
that first draft.
My understanding is slightly more nuanced now than it was then. But I think it is a journey with the Bible. It's not an obvious and easy thing to grapple with. It's precisely one of the reasons I love it. Actually, is that it gives you something to wrestle with. I've often described my journey with the Bible like that experience of Jacob. Finding this encounter and wrestling, but coming out at times a bit more broken, but hopefully a lot more blessed through it as well. And I think that's been my journey. I know when I was in my teenage years, I sort of I swerved away from the faith that my parents, confessed.
Differentiation.
I didn't get into anything too serious. I got sent home from a...
He's trying to keep his Christian day job.
Christian camp for bad behaviour. That was about as bad as it got, but...
Could be worse.
I do remember in my teenage years, the late teens, sort of coming back to a position of faith now for the first time, owning it, and beginning to read the Bible. And that was piecemeal, I think. I still had an approach to the Bible that assumed it was largely some statements that I should learn and some moral tales that I should know. And then I had a conversation actually with someone I put this in the book, but I had a conversation with somebody on a beach where I was talking about the Bible, and he was very skeptical about it. And I can't remember how I got into this conversation. I think it was about 18. And
had a great conversation with a young man. He's still on the fence whether or not we'll share it, but what Christians can learn when they go out on their little mission trips if they pay attention. And this story is another great story about that.
And he said to me, well, have you read it? And I sort of paused, and he sort of pressed me and said, have you read all of it? And I had to acknowledge that I hadn't. And he said, well, how do you know it's not full of contradictions then? And
because my parents are really credible people, and they raised me well, and they embedded me with this rough draft, and they gave me practices, and they taught that it was a holy book. There's a way that Christians keep apologizing for their parents' faithfulness and forming them. And what's really funny is that I talk to a lot of people who weren't raised with good Christian parents who formed and shaped them via the Bible. And they tell me, gosh, I wish my parents had done that for me. And I see that now because we see a generation of people that have been raised far from it. And I mean, this is a multi-generational project, the deconstructed notwithstanding. And somebody made a comment that I thought was very fair. I'm not trying to straw man the deconstructed. I actually think, see, now we get in trouble with other people. I actually think a lot of the deconstruction that is happening is vital for the health of the church. And there's a lot of stuff that the church needs to be called on. And, these angry, hurt, deconstructed people are doing that job. So, and it's forcing the church to sit back and examine some things. And yeah, fair enough. That's important. But So I know someone who is, I think it was raised Catholic. Doesn't do much, I got to know him a little bit. I don't want to give too many details because just in the odd chance someone might be able to figure who he is out by the story, but huge, there's millions of people like this, huge Star Wars fan, raising their children to love Star Wars. I know people, these sports teams, Oakland Raiders fan, or if you're a fan of the Sacramento Kings, it's truly a Calvinist Augustinian story because your life will be full of suffering because your team will never win. Good old Freddie, loyal. You get if you came to this channel for local sports news in Sacramento, Freddie and Paul show. We always have a sports section in the Freddie and Paul show. So I've now plugged the Freddie and Paul show twice in this video. I can tell Freddie that on Sunday. I plugged our show twice, Fred. So good on me. But I don't for a minute regret the fact that my parents raised me with a very crunchy faith. I find it to be sometimes heavy, but one of the most alive, passionate, exciting areas of my life. And because I was raised in this from a very early age, just by virtue of psychology, it runs deep and it's powerful. And so, I too often hear Christians make apology for this, and I think, don't apologize for that. It's a beautiful thing.
And so I sort of went away chastened and began to read the Bible, whether I'd recommend this to others or not, from cover to cover. And I have to say that was a real turning point, because for the first time I grasped, firstly, how knotty and complex the Bible is. I think I just not understood some of
Knotty, not Naughty. It's kind of naughty that way too sometimes.
That, but I also grasped something of, well, this is actually a coherent narrative. As Tom says, there's a deliberate reason why the two testaments were brought under one cover. It was a deep conviction that
the dude's talking, leave the camera on him, or these other guys got arrested. I don't want to collapse in their chair and take a deep breath, get a drink. It's probably some film standard that's the right way to do it, and I do it wrong. I keep the camera on people the whole time, but go ahead, pick your nose, go to the bathroom. It happens.
The two testaments nevertheless narrate one larger story, and so I've kind of grown into that, really, and to some degree made that now something that I have both written about and spoken about quite widely. But you then go through university, don't you? And then I did a geography degree first, and then a theology degree, and then theology.
You did a what degree? Geography?
You then have both written about and spoken about quite widely. But you then go through university, don't you? And then I did a geography degree first.
Geography, then theology? What kind of career counseling did this guy get?
First, and then a theology degree, and then theology doctorate, and you do that kind of experience. And of course, in a secular Western context, you face all kinds of challenges to the convictions that you have, and I think that,
especially on that side of the pond. Here in America, we got lots of us Christians.
Refines them and revises them, but largely I feel my confidence in the coherence of the Bible is stronger.
What's been your change?
Justin's gonna hate me. He's never gonna have me on his show after this video.
In relationship with the Bible, I suppose, especially in the last few years, Tom. I mean, do you still tend to kind of approach it essentially as a historical document, or you said you're reading it more as a sacred text now? I mean, in a personal way, or what does that look like?
Well, that was the great change for me, was that before I came to Right Dominion, I was looking at, as I said, as a collection of historical sources. So if I was writing about, I don't know, the Persians, I would look at Isaiah as a source for how the Judean exiles viewed Cyrus and Persian rule, or indeed the book of Job as a kind of source for how they were refracting their understanding of the Persian court and things like that.
I'd better look up some commentaries on Job. I didn't know about the Persian connection.
when I came to write Dominion, I realized that, of course, I've got to try and understand the Bible as the people that I'm writing about understood it. And that required me to essentially shift the gear so that I was not looking at the Bible as a collection of texts that had evolved in response to specific historical circumstances and had come to have kind of meaning imposed on them by subsequent generations that perhaps hadn't originally been intended. Instead, I had to view it as a kind of enormous anthology of poetry, all of which joined together.
Keep the video on the speaker.
And there were two particular moments that kind of recalibrated it for me. And the first, I think,
Justin's got his listening thing down.
And the most significant was looking at Paul's letters and realizing that Paul's understanding of what was going on with the crucifixion and the resurrection and the unexpected fact that the Messiah had turned out to be crucified had been the fruit of Paul going through the scriptures that he was intimately familiar with and drawing this conclusion. So that in a sense...
And this is why, Jacob, I'm talking about you, because you're like the best access to deeply Jewish belief that I've got going right now. This is why Paul, and Jacob sent me some videos about this. This is why Paul is the controversial dude.
It's the founding theological texts for Christianity derived from, as far as we can tell, because Paul is the earliest surviving source that we have, that it's witness to the way in which the very earliest Christians were looking at Jewish scripture and saying...
Now I'm going to sort of play a card I don't usually play. Not only looking at Jewish scripture, but Paul is grappling with, 1 Corinthians 15. Paul goes to Jerusalem. He has this vision. Now, why would Paul lie about it? Paul talks about this vision many times. He has this vision. He goes to Jerusalem, and he wants to know, because the physical matters, okay? Matters. There's that word. And so what's been... Sorry, Tom, to interrupt at this point, and you've got more to say, and we'll go back to it. The beauty of video. What I'm really wrestling with over the last few weeks is this deep relationship between Jewish Christian religion and history. And that's what a lot of this is, and we're going to really get into it in this video a little bit later. Gosh, I got to keep moving. And this gets into my God number 1 and God number 2. Because in a sense, anything that happens is the will of God. Calvinism. But not everything that happens is good. So how do you preserve the goodness of God in a world that there's much evil? God number 1 is this imminent substitute for, let's say Christine Hayes' Meta-Divine Realm. But yet God number 1 is modulated first by the book of Job and then radically by the crucifixion. And it's that data that Paul of Tarsus has to somehow integrate. If he gets convinced that Jesus is the Messiah, well, of course, Messiah is not a neutral term. And Messiah is, and the canonical Gospels, I'm working in the Gospel of John right now. Wrote my sermon this morning for this week. the canonical Gospels and the rest of the New Testament, but the canonical Gospels in narrative form radically deconstruct the assumptions of Messiah with respect to the way that history rolls out. And it is an extension in many ways. If the Hebrew prophets hadn't, when Nebuchadnezzar came down and destroyed the temple, if the Hebrew prophets hadn't somehow integrated the destruction of the nation and the temple into the narrative, so that was the data point, into the narrative of the God that they had been worshiping. And when Ezekiel, for example, by the canal outside of Babylon, sees the Lord in his chariot throne, and integrates all of this. And, the book of Ezekiel is a wild book. That integration then sets up the radical integration of a Messiah that can be crucified and then rises again. And I'm still not there in terms of having the language to talk about it. I feel like in some ways I'm sort of pregnant with some of these ideas, and they're stretching me, but I can't give birth to them yet, and they're on their way. And that's why I make these videos, because I'm talking it out and I'm sort of recording it in real time. And this is why Peterson and Holland are so fascinating to me, because I think, Peterson in terms of science and psychology and Darwin, and Holland in terms of history and narrative. And in some ways, these are two sides of me that are battling it out. Once I give birth to these ideas, you'll be the first to know, because they'll come out here and it'll be a mess. And if I'm father of 5 children, I've been in the birthing room for every one of them, and it's always a delightful mess.
Saying, okay, what does this tell us? And that was crucial for me, because up until that point, I'd kind of thought, well, the Christian scripture, the New Testament, is a misunderstanding of the Old Testament. It must be, because they're back projecting assumptions onto these scriptures that can't exist there. But to realize that, in a sense, the building blocks of Christian theology came from the close reading of what comes to be called the Old Testament by Christians.
That is a deeply postmodern point, because in a sense, what Tom Holland did was understand, well, and for a historian, you sort of joke, because, the good thing about history is we're always making new, but that is way more true than most people who are not very familiar with history understand, because historians are always making new history out of our view of the sets of the physical, but not just the physical, because it's the narrative that is shaping the physical and our view of it. And so if you listen to his podcast with Dominic Sandbrook, that I can't recommend more highly. Every time that podcast drops, it's like bang, I hit it. And I've done commentary on some of them here, and it's just tremendous. But you get a sense of what history is, and again, when I say that, they're modernist historians. They're looking back through the storytelling, try to discern the physicality, and have the physicality and the story back there then inform our story, because maybe there's another video I should put here.
And I'm like, pattern, Pajot.
There you go.
There you go.
Let the meme guys get a hold of that
let
one.
Let the symbolic memes guy go.
Mushroom.
All right, enough of that. But that's what historians do. We're doing history because we're looking at the pattern, and we're watching us watch ourselves, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So
really kind of opened my mind to the relationship between the two bodies of text, the relationship between old and new, and kind of affirmed for me how fundamentally joined they were, and that if I was going to understand the Christian Bible, I had to read it in that light. I had to look for Jesus in the Old Testament as well as in the New. The second,
which of course, after the resurrection, what does Jesus keep telling his apostles? The Old Testament spoke of this. And you find this all throughout the New Testament. And if you look at something like this, Commentary on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, this is by two conservative Reformed scholars, G.K. Beale and D.A. Carson. Look at how fat this book is. It's a really big deal for Christians. And one of the things as a pastor you realize, because I'll regularly, if I just hold this up, I don't have to go to the gym. I regularly get asked, well, what was prophesied? And one of the things you figure out eventually with respect to that question is, if you really track down all the citations of the Old Testament in the New, and they are all over the place, you begin to realize they didn't read the text like we do. And when we look for a prophecy, we're thinking of Nostradamus, or we're thinking of, something in the modern age that, a man with spray-on tan will come into the White House and sit upon a golden throne overlooking Manhattan. We're thinking about something like that. And it didn't work that way. But the more you read the New Testament, the more you begin to understand how they were thinking. And this, again, is sort of where, I don't know why that video doesn't stay up. This is where pattern, archetypos, that's where that comes into play. And so, what's going to happen then with the church fathers is, well, we'll get there. I should keep playing, otherwise I'll never get through this video.
second was writing about Origen, the great church father in 3rd century Alexandria, who's by far my favourite of the church fathers. And he talks about the entirety of Scripture. And he says, he's quoting his Jewish teacher, who says that the whole of Scripture is like an enormous mansion with many rooms, and the keys are scattered around this mansion in different places. So you have to go through all the mansion to find the keys, and then find them to match them with the correct lock. And I kind of love that as a kind of almost Borgesian metaphor, this idea that the Bible maps onto, I suppose, the entirety of the cosmos, that it's transforming the whole of the cosmos into a collection of texts, a collection of books, and yet that there are keys and that you can turn them and go into new rooms and discover new things. And of course, that understanding of the Bible has been so influential over the course of the centuries, and is one that I think has been profoundly neglected, both by
before we get to the neglect, what a vision. But now I can't hear that and not hear Sam Harris, okay, saying, I could read a cookbook. Yeah, but this book has been doing that for 2,000 years. Now, maybe 2,000 years from now, they'll do it from a cookbook, but neither you nor I are going to be here. And then you have Jordan Peterson come around and say, yeah, and this book has built this civilization. And if you have pattern, if you have Jonathan Peugeot, Mr. Pattern Man, his main theme is, what makes you think things are so arbitrary? Because the contemporary narrative, which says it's all arbitrary, and then people look at the data and say it's arbitrary, you can say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, okay, you were raised Christian, and so you have this narrative. Well, you were raised nihilistic, so you say there's no narrative. You're just as much a function of what's coming out of your mouth is just as much a function of the narrative that I am. We're both speaking from these narratives.
A lot of the most kind of and is one that I think has been profoundly neglected, both by a lot of the most kind of foghorn wielding Christians, the kind of fundamentalists, the people who say there is a definite solid answer, it tells us this, it's absolute, you've got to take it literally, and of course by atheists who in a sense are other side of the same coin, also assuming that this is what the Bible is. And to get back to that kind of the rich metaphor.
And now, I just made that video about deconstructives sort of surfing the blur. It isn't a function of taking it seriously, because it's very clear that the kind of fight that Christianity, that the rise of Christianity and the work of the Apostle Paul, if you read the book of Acts, the dude can't, it's like every town he goes to the synagogue and he's going to start a riot. And if he doesn't start a riot in the synagogue, he's going to have the Greeks of the town, want to either worship him and later string him up. You can read about that in the book of Acts. So it isn't a function of the seriousness with which you take the text. And in the modern frame, that's usually so in a way, get back to George Marsden's fundamentalism in American culture. The cultural vehicle by which fundamentalists after the Civil War and after Darwin could express seriousness was assertions of certain kinds of physicality. That's what they did. And so, we might look at them and say, oh, how could you do that? And they took a drubbing for it. And they continue to do so. But if you can translate, because they're speaking modernity, they have no other language. And if you can understand, when they say literal, they mean serious. Maybe you can have a little bit more mercy, because they're trying to work it out. And then, of course, you that gets pushed so far, it gets just a little bit crazy sometimes, and you're going to have creation science, and you're going to have all kinds of things happening. But that's why, because, sort of like in Brett Sockold's book, Transubstantiation, Luther can't read Aquinas because too much stuff has shifted underneath. And so, as Brett Sockold, wants to get at, Luther and Calvin are trying to re-articulate Aquinas, but they're doing so against Aquinas because too much stuff has changed underneath. That's a powerful thesis. And I found, Brett quite compelling in that. So, this is what's happening. And, in all fairness to the fundamentalists, especially over the last 40 years, they've taken a beating for their faith. And they didn't know that there was another way to say serious besides physical, because that's the terms in modernity. Because that's the stuff that the sort of bifurcation in the Protestant Reformation, what that launches.
For equality that you get not just in Origin but in all the church fathers was I find it incredibly liberating.
I'm sure that's music to your ears, Andrew. In that sense, I suppose you could only hope that other people would have a similar journey to Tom of coming to appreciate the coherence of this, as you say. What kind of, for you though, are the big sort of takeaways that you would want people to know from your book of the way that the Bible stacks together, and what people often miss when they're just looking at the kind of, I don't know, just trying to sort of work out, did this happen, did that happen? What for you of them is the bigger picture we should be looking at here?
Well, I think in part it's...
And now he's going to talk for a little while, then going to get interrupted, then it's going to get really interesting. Christians haven't been able to figure out how to address this stuff yet. And so that's what we're working on. As C.S. Lewis, really worked hard on it in Miracles and in other ways. And he, for all of Lewis's brilliance and eloquence, he doesn't, towards the end of this book, you sort of get the best shot he can take at it, but he these really hard questions take a ton of us to do it. It's sort of like, I know some of you are going to love this illustration, Bitcoin mining. But it takes C.S. Lewis and scores of people, and not just Christian people, but atheists and new atheists, and it takes an estuary, it takes an ecosystem to really work on these kinds of things. Again, I get back to Vervaeke opponent processing. Vervaeke on unbelievable would be fun. Oh, that could be fun. It's have to be longer than an hour because John's got to be very gracious in a short amount of time then. But it takes an estuary for us to really solve these hard problems.
Simply an acknowledgement that the Bible is seeking, at least, I mean, it's a claim and you can contest it, but it is seeking to tell a meta-narrative, a grand narrative, and that this narrative told through the Christian scriptures, the Old and the New Testaments, that in some way it's a universal narrative. I think that's one of the take-homes. I think so often people pigeonhole the Bible as a religious text for those who are already committed, but actually the whole story is framed on the universal scale, isn't it? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It sounds like the beginning of a story, and it's an all-encompassing narrative. And so I've often compared the Bible, as others have, to an hourglass. That's the shape of the story. It begins.
I like this illustration, but it's a really weird hourglass because you have like Genesis 1 through 11, and then it's,
with the widest angle, tells an origin story. Then it does funnel down into a more particular story, in particular through the Abraham covenant, this nation of Israel emerging. But even as the story narrows down into that nation, God's purpose is being expressed for all of creation. Abraham was promised, in you and through your descendants, all families on earth will be blessed. So even as it goes local, there's still something of a kind of what we would call a global vision to it, which I think is remarkable to have that written in.
It's not unusual, though. I mean, many decide to do this, I think, in terms of how the Christians finished the book. Because definitely, I mean, part of what happens with Jesus is, and then Paul especially, is they universalize the story in a very particular way. And that universalization is also deeply tied to the deconstruction and reconstruction of messiahship. And of course, the book of Revelation at the end, just finishes it nicely.
Into a story so early on, and that theme plays out. So what you've got is this tension of a creative tension in the Old Testament of Israel's God being the creator God, So there is monotheism, there is one God, and yet he's elected, he's chosen this particular nation. And I think that tension is crucial to understanding the Old Testament. But what it does mean is that God, in that sense, has made a covenant with a particular people. And when that people are oppressed, then in Egypt, in slavery, under the boot of the superpower of the day, it's part of the narrative that God is a God who brings freedom for those who are oppressed and sides with those who are marginalized against the powerful. I think that's written right in to the Old Testament narrative, and salvation ultimately is Exodus when it comes to the Bible. It's that narrative of liberation.
And okay, now my thesis again for the book of Revelation is that it is a summary of the Hebrew prophets, including the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is a deeply it's one of the main sources of the book of Revelation. And so this liberation motif, like I said, I mean, in the 1980s, I read liberation theology. That's what young man in his 20s growing up in Patterson, check those off your things. Going down to Latin America, learned a few things when I was in Latin America. Anyway.
And so, in other words, the hourglass, you do funnel down, and ultimately it funnels right down to one particular point of this Jesus of Nazareth, right? The whole of the story, from a Christian perspective, funnels down to a moment where the hopes of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, are resting on the shoulders of this Messiah figure. And his death seems to bring that to an end, and his resurrection brings it to a new beginning. And then from that, hence the hourglass, the whole story then opens back out again as the hope of and the salvation of the Messiah is offered to all nations. And then you finish the Bible, the narrative completes. You know, it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the center of the middle, in terms of significance, is the center of gravity of the whole story, Jesus Christ. But the ending then glimpses scenes that Christians believe lie ahead of us. You know, there is this future hope of a new creation.
And that's right, because part of the difficulty with mythology and the sort of way that, let's say, Michael Shermer is trying to process this stuff, because again, I mean, I appreciated Jordan Peterson's conversation with Michael Shermer, because got to know a little bit more about Michael Shermer and that. But time has to be figured into this thing, because mythology can sort of be static, just out there. And we are creatures of time, and so time has to be a function of this. And so all of these attempts to sort of take time out will be reductions of the story
of resurrection, and it's a brilliantly hopeful climax to a story that is very honest about the suffering and pain and tragedy of life in the real world. So I suppose, you know, if you're going to take anything away from the as a headline, it's that the Bible is a universal story with a messianic center, but also that it's real. That is to say, and this has always been one of the things that I've been surprised by as I engage with the Bible, is that it doesn't hide from the gritty realities of life.
Now, it's interesting. Okay, so whenever people say certain words, I always listen very carefully. And one of those words is real. And so, you know, you can find my video on the grime line. Why is the grime line so powerful to us? Because it's granular, it's textual, it's extremely high resolution, it's complex, it's got chaos built into it at a very low level. It's things that we cannot predict. And so the Bible is able to have that quality to it. Now, that's what he means by real there. But, you know, real, you know, physical things are also real in certain ways. I haven't used the music stand or the cell phone stand for a while.
It's not neatly airbrushed out. Some things that sometimes when we read it, even as Christians, you almost wish that wasn't there. But it's very real, and the characters in the story are very flawed. And for me, that is crucial to the account, because written into the very beginning in the origin story is this idea of a fall, what Christian theologians have called a fall, a descent from how we were intended to be to how we now live. And so
notice, now the fall theologically, and hey, I do this all the time too, intention. The fall is about intention. Is it about death? I mean, these are huge areas of because again, we've got the narrative and we've got the data and we've got the physical elements of the data, and we're adjusting these two things constantly.
Characters in the story are not the heroes that you might expect. They've not been written up as
Tom, did you want to come in?
Yeah, because I was just wondering, Andrew's description of the Bible being full of flawed characters.
Tom Holland is about to lay a big question right here. I love this part of the video.
I mean, there has been a sense, right from at least the 2nd century AD, that among those flawed characters is the God of the Old Testament, which is why Marcion, the first person we know who tries to construct a canon, basically just gets rid of it.
This is why you need an estuary. You need someone to come in and ask a question like this, because ask this question in church. But there's a reason, church should be open to everything. No, Peterson was quite right. Not everything can be open to everything. And Peugeot is quite right. That doesn't work. But right here, right now, the elephant in the room, God number 1, Arenic. God number 2, Agentic. The representation of God number 2 in the Old Testament. Is he a flawed character? Ooh, now, and when you ask that question, you're asking it with the citizens of Jerusalem watching their temple burn. You're asking it with Ezekiel when God says to do these crazy things. You're asking it to Jeremiah when, God asked Jeremiah to do these insane things. You're asking it to any of the prophets. You're asking it to Job. You're asking it to Jesus. He's very much in the lineage of the prophets. He says it all the time. You're asking it to the disciples. You're asking it to people who signed on to Christianity thinking and hoping that it would somehow be a buffer against the painful chaos of this world. It's a big question.
And there's always been a kind of a slight tension there, I think, throughout Christian history, a kind of Marcionite trend to say that actually there's quite a lot in the Old Testament that is embarrassing, and that the behavior of God in the Old Testament is a source of embarrassment. And I mean, I don't know whether you two would agree with this, but I have a sense, looking at the contemporary churches, all of them, that there is a kind of Marcionite cringe in all of them, that they are nervous. There is very little engagement with the God who smites the Amalekites.
Christian Reformed Church, I should say, we have sometimes been spoken of as the Jews of the Protestant evangelical world, because historically you go into a Christian Reformed church and the 10 Commandments are on the wall, and historically we'd say them every week, and maybe that's because so many of us Jews got into the Christian Reformed Church early on. I don't know. But Tom's point is a very important one. And these are the tensions. And these are the tensions that I'm wrestling with in terms of this God number 1, Arenic God. And if I hadn't watched this video this morning, I was very seriously thinking of doing a video on Lil Nas X, because I've been thinking a lot about this satanic symbolism, because Peugeot has been working on it. And there's, we're not done with all of this stuff.
Or smites the Israelites for having a census, or any of that kind of stuff. So I just wondered, do you think that that's a fair observation?
I'm going to get Andrew to respond to that after we go to a quick break. And I'm sorry to cut in on it, because that's today asking author of the recent going to be speaking at the conversation. It's some bonus part of today's show. We're asking, can the Bible, a story, the scripture, say that the Bible, talking about with Tom Holland as well on the show today. As I've mentioned, Tom is as well, the 15th of May. Asking you, Andrew, yes, the Bible's
Probably Andrew's like, at least give me a couple minutes to think about this one.
full of imperfect characters. Is one of them God?
Keep a straight face. Don't let them see me sweat.
And other churches are a bit ashamed of some bits of the Bible. And like it or not, we all act a bit like Marcion and tend to sweep those embarrassing bits under the carpet and don't really dust them off, in our service.
Boy, this produces a lot of stuff, but it's not ready to come out of my mouth yet. So, wow.
Is very much. So, yeah, what's your thoughts on all of that?
Well, I think my first answer is yes. I do think that to the second question is yes. I do think the church has a tendency to become Marcionite, partly because I think it's hard enough today in a secular context to communicate something of what the Bible's about. And understandably, there's a sort of rush to go to if you've got a very short bandwidth, let's go straight to the center and talk about Jesus because he seems the easiest and most important to communicate. So some of it may just be pure attention span, how difficult it is to help people understand the Old Testament. Do we need to go there? But I do think also, if you're going to tear into the Bible, the Old Testament is often the place to go. And yet I think when it comes to Tom's first point, is God one of the bad characters? I mean, I think ultimately,
Or flawed.
flawed.
Tom's being gracious. I want to just mention this book, Skeleton in God's Closet, by Joshua Ryan Butler, which I thought he deals with hell, judgment, and holy war in the Bible. And I read this book a number of years ago, and I thought it was quite excellent. And so some of you who wrestle with some of these issues might want to take a look at that book. So let me pop it down here.
Well, flawed characters. Okay, we'll go with flawed, yeah. I think firstly, I've been helped by the principle that I think, Calvin and others lent on, which is sort of a sense of divine accommodation, that there is a sense in which at times in the Old Testament, what we're understanding is a God who is working through imperfect circumstances to bring about his purpose. And at times, like, for example, the conquest of the Promised Land, that involves some use of force, and that's difficult. I haven't got easy answers to that, but I think divine accommodation, a sense of God using working within the cultures and the periods in which the Bible is written. It's a story rooted in real. If it's a story rooted in real history, then it's going to involve some of those, if you like, necessary actions that are.
Now that little point that he made about a story rooted in real history is really important at this point, because the fact that, number one, the Bible has endured. Number two, that it's taken very seriously, and taken very seriously for choosing how you behave in this world. That's, in a sense, the sacred, when we approach the Bible as a sacred text, when we approach this as a serious subject. Critical Drinker had a very interesting video about canon, as did Doomcock, who, Rick showed me the Doomcock channel too, where he's, and Doomcock is in some ways trying to maintain the Star Wars universe as a viable sacred text for him. And people are using modern movies as sacred texts for them. That shows that this is serious, and Christians aren't backing away from this. And it actually is sort of the opposite side of the coin of the realness that, I forgot his name, Andrew Allerton is making the point of.
Are part of the process. But I also think that in addition to divine accommodation, I also think that what you're seeing with the Bible, and hence the two testaments, is two different covenants. And part of what's changing in the Bible, either you fundamentally believe that God is changing in the Bible, which is in a sense where Marcion arrived, there's two different kinds of deity, or at least the one deity's had some kind of conversion.
And, process theology sort of stalks some of this, and open theism, because those are all ways to try to address some of these issues.
And the New Testament is now God as a Christian. So either God is changing, or the covenant is changing. And I think some of what we're seeing in the shift is this new covenant made in the blood of the Messiah that means how we relate to God is fundamentally altered.
Now I think we should also point out that it's a tension in a question like this that actually keeps the religion real and moving forward. We had our men's Bible. We have our men's Bible study on Wednesday night, and we were in the Beatitudes, and those Beatitudes, Jesus goes right into it, right there. And of course, you cannot read Jesus in the canonical Gospels and not see him as deeply conversant and living, put in your skepticism about him. Okay. Don't worry about any of the theology around him. The picture of him is that he believed this stuff. And I think part of what holds Christianity together is that Jesus doesn't blink at this. And, part of this, I think, is, and I find this often with modern readers, they're doing sort of a selective reading of Jesus. He's got the sheep and the goats. He's got locked doors and bridegrooms that didn't bring oil and weeping and gnashing of teeth. And, Jordan Peterson keeps mentioning that Carl Jung thought the Book of Revelation was, sort of tacked on because, we're sort of the tension was getting away. God was now too nice and wasn't going to be believable. And so we all have our mappings, and this is a critical one. And again, this one also gets into this idea that I've been thinking about in terms of God number one, the Arenic God, and in a sense the karmic God. Boy, Anselman is going to have me for that one.
So I'm not saying that's a comprehensive answer, but I think it gives part of the answer to why they seem so different on a surface reading.
Could I, another question, which again, I very rarely, and this may be just my lack of listening attentively to sermons, but
it might not help you much.
That thing I mentioned about Paul going through Scripture and finding Jesus in Scripture. Now, there are obvious places where, so at Christmas, the reading of Isaiah and the Suffering Servant and the prophecy of Bethlehem and all that kind of thing is part of it. But is Jesus? I mean, is Jesus the voice in the burning bush? Is he to be thought of that? Is it the Trinity that turns up to Abraham? Is that the angels? Is Jacob wrestling with Jesus? Should Christians be framing the Trinity in those terms? Is Jesus present within the narratives of the Old Testament?
Well, I mean, I think my answer is that back to what I was saying earlier, if the Bible is one coherent story with one God from creation to new creation, then, and if Jesus,
one God, three persons, Sam is going to be stalking this conversation too. I mean, I think it's actually a good sign that we're revisiting these levels of questions. And again, that's going to scare a lot of people. No. But you can't, if your goal is to reaffirm, you can't not revisit. And I realize that's terribly scary stuff. And it's in these open waters where heresy breeds and grows. But I think finally the call of faith is to walk on water and to follow that Lamb wherever he goes. And, 3 years ago when I started making these videos, I had some real, so a colleague of mine stopped listening to Jordan Peterson because he said, I'm listening to Jordan Peterson more than I'm reading the Bible. I get plenty of comments on this question. Don't talk so much about Jordan Peterson. Okay. Watch my sermons. There's plenty of them online. The church doesn't do itself a favor when it hides from these questions.
Jesus Christ is to be identified with that God, then God's actions in the Old Testament in some way have a coherence with the person of Jesus Christ as he is then made known in the New Testament. So, are there pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus? Is the angel of the Lord, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus?
And you can find tons of conversation about this in theology.
I can understand, at times it seems like Jacob thinks that he's wrestled with God, and well, then what is that? And so it's not Jesus of Nazareth, right? But there is a sense in which a pre-incarnate manifestation. I mean,
And if you go all the way back to my conversation with Nathan Jacobs, what is a person? And as we're wrestling with this meaning crisis, a la John Vervaeke, in many ways, that's at the heart of it. What is a person? What is agency? What are we? And what is a pre-incarnate Christ? Is that the angel of the Lord? Is that who visits Abraham and negotiates? No. We first need to confess a lot of ignorance, but it's in the story, and so therefore it's fundamental.
A theophany, a sort of manifesting of God's presence. Now, I think that said, I think you often see this you see this in the Reformation playing out, don't you? That Luther and Calvin were very opposed to each other on how much of Christ, if you like, they read back into the Old Testament. And I think there can be this kind of hide and seek game that's played that's really unhelpful. But I think that so many, and I think, N.T. Wright's been really helpful for me here, so many of the symbols and stories of the Old Testament, symbols from Sabbath to temple, and stories from, David and Goliath right through to the exile period, so many of these stories find their fulfillment in Jesus. And what I think you do see with the New Testament writers is that a little bit like a sort of film where there's a big reveal at the end, maybe a murder mystery or something. Once you've seen the big reveal at the end, you can't help but run back through the entire plot and realize, oh, of course, that was that clue. Or that. So I think there.
And that's really critical because, when you read Paul and the Mysterion and, well, what do you mean a mystery? And so often preachers and Christians sort of use that word to punt. But the way that he just laid it out, it's something that is revealed later in the plot.
There is a legitimate reading that says actually we read the Bible backwards and forwards, and Jesus makes sense of the Old Testament as much as the New. Yeah.
Tom, did you? I mean, where's that question coming from? I suppose and I suppose my question for you is, at this point, obviously Andrew is dealing with the Bible both as a historical source, but also obviously as a believer, as someone who believes there's a God whose hand has divinely conspired to bring this together.
And, Justin lays this out pretty much as we would expect a Christian to lay it out. But this again brings me back to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, where C.S. Lewis deals with this in Hard Red Things, because we imagine that we can sort of demythologize all of these pictures away. And then Lewis sort of runs through that and then says, and then you find you can't. And you find you can't because of who you are looking at it. And this actually will come in later in this conversation because of how we are. This is the best language available to us. This is the best conceptualization. Well, what do I mean by best? Well, it's the one that best scales. It's the one that best moves us. It's and so then when we get into the Vervaeke question about narrative, it's kind of like, well, you don't have to drive to the store. You could take a dog sled. Well, I'd have to get a couple more Rottweilers, and then, well, it can't be a dog sled like in northern Canada or Alaska and the Iditarod where it's going to go on snow. I'd have to have some wheels, and I'd need to have some directionals, and the state of California would have to approve it for use on public roads, and might as well take the car. And that's how I feel with some of these ideas that, well, why don't you know it non-narratively? Well, narrative is this massive compression engine by which I can reliably manage the world, and via our public culture, and to whatever degree via our own development, we come to the place that narrative is the means by which we do this, and we use characters, and even the way that these excellent, challenging questions are framed, they're framed as narrative. And they have grip as narrative. And they can't be dealt with in any other way besides narrative. So, and that's the way that we manage it historically.
Whatever you think about the specific historical elements of it, it's a God-ordained thing, this thing we call the Bible, and the story of Jesus and the way it all maps onto each other.
And when we say it's God-ordained, I mean, that's where all the Jordan Peterson stuff comes in, because what do we mean by that? Well, it's because over thousands of years of narrative and data and mapping and remapping and communal and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, this is the best we can do. And now, of course, the comment section is full of people who, I don't think this is the best we can do. I like this one over here. Oh, okay. I'm thankful that we're in a period of time where we're experimenting with much broader public maps than were permitted 500 years ago. I have many friends who are not Christians, and I don't want and don't believe in the Trinity, and I don't want, to be John Calvin to them as Servetus. And I have many other friends who don't go to church, and I'm glad we're not living in, Plymouth Plantation where maybe they can be up in charges. And even the Christian Reformed Church that a couple of generations ago, discipline was practiced. And when I look at, okay, was that better? Was it worse? I can't answer those questions very easily. And so,
is that somewhere where you're willing to go? I mean, and that's a very personal question in a sense. Is that kind of
pesky JB
kind of something that you're kind of are open to at this point, that it's more than just, in that sense, a historical document?
And now, of course, I mean, I got credentials here, so, but how do you answer a question like this? Because as a pastor, I look at churches and I think, none of us know what we're dealing with. I love this Annie Dillard quote. Maybe I'll pull it up. Gosh, I'm running out of time. This is taking forever. Why do people in church seem like cheerful, brainless tourists on a package tour of the absolute? Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke? You see, and I think Tom Holland does, and Jordan Peterson does, and many of us who have been sort of domesticated into the church don't do it justice. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness to wear lady straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, for the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us to where we can never return. And see, you know, when the pandemic hit and I heard Tom Holland wrestling with those issues, and when I talked to how many people on this channel, this is the God they want. And the banality of so many of us, and myself as a steward of the church, is just unbecoming and unattractive. Yet. Christ comes not eating and drinking, and they call him a glutton. John the Baptist has the apocalypse. He's wearing it, you know, as he's, you know, a leather belt and camel fur and noshing on locusts. And Jesus comes and, oh.
Well, that's the mindset that I had to adopt when I was, you know, everything. I had to engage.
And he's adopted the mindset, and he wants to know, where's my life preserver? Where's my crash helmet? But probably only half of him wants to know that, because the other half, I don't want. I've got a life and a family and a job and a career, and I'd rather not have that messed up.
With what the Bible is for the people that I was writing and studying. And I had to stop thinking about it just as a kind of compilation of texts. And I had to let...
You know, the figure John Brown comes to mind of the American Civil War period. Someone that seems to come straight out of the Bible. And, you know, he... Bloody Kansas, he hacks up, you know, pro-slavery people with a long sword. And he tries to, you know, prime the pump of the apocalypse by taking the armory at Harper's Ferry. And he leaves a prophetic note with his executioner. And, well, he believed. Well, is there anything halfway between John Brown and Ravi Zacharias?
The power of it, I had to be open to the power of it in that sense. And so in a sense, I guess in a way that, you know, these are the questions that it provokes. I'm not asking this, you know, as a historian or anything. I'm asking because these were a lot of the thoughts that came to me as I was reading it and thinking, well, you know, I have questions.
Well, and Christians say the Bible is the Word of God. What do we mean by that? The Bible is this thing that speaks to us from the sky that, you know, turned the Apostle Paul from Saul to Paul and has, you know, turned him around and changed his life. And, you know, some of you might open the Bible and I remember when Job was, someone just recently went through all of my conversations with Job. What a fun thing. The whole Job playlist. But I remember early on, Job was reading the Bible and he's just commenting to his wife, you know, what's going on in this book? And now, you know, Job is making profession of faith in his Dutch Reformed church. You can find, especially people in prison. Look at the story of Son of Sam. You can find it all the time in prison. You know, I read this book and it just grabbed me, and my life had to change. And others read and nothing.
Not as someone kind of you know, looking at them as I might a kind of, you know, dissected frog on a table or something to probe it, but because, you know, reading it, I guess with a kind of in an Origen-esque spirit, saying, you know, okay, so if it's a huge room where the keys are, then this is an obvious, you know, these are the questions that I have. How does it all join together? And I guess
ask and you'll find, knock and the door will be open. you have to kind of go to God and take the book and say, hey, I want in. Even then, he's the one that gets to decide. Darn Dutch Calvinist.
Yes, that there's a, I talked about Marcionism as it's a kind of anti-Semitic perspective, that the God of the Old Testament isn't good enough for the God of the Old, to be the God of the New Testament. But I think there is also a kind of a reverse, a kind of desire not to culturally appropriate scriptures that are perhaps specific to Jews.
Well, Christians have a lot to answer for in terms of their treatment to the Jews.
And I think that also may be a inhibiting factor for Christians who are aware of the kind of the legacy of anti-Semitism within Christianity. About kind of saying, well, actually, your scriptures, they're all Christian. So I don't know whether you think that's an issue as well.
Certainly that has been for me, Tom, I would say. Firstly, I think you're right to note that there are real dangers in detaching the Old Testament from the New Testament in terms of what becomes unaccountable, I suppose. The narrative framework of the entire scriptures, that it is the God of Israel who has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, is vital. And that, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, there are specific purposes that only make sense, particularly unpacked in Romans, that only make sense that Paul has in mind when those two are thoroughly integrated. But I also think, for me personally, having been taught biblical Hebrew by a Jewish rabbi, I remember just finding that a very refreshing experience for me to think about how to sensitively read the Hebrew scriptures in the light, as a Christian, in a way that did justice to this person's faith and commitment whilst not diminishing my own. And so I do think that
it's interesting. Just when he said that, it occurred to me, because part of what I think about when I think about the biblical history or the universal history video with Jonathan Pageau is just the nature of putting letters on page, where authorial intent is a big deal to the degree that any of us even know why we're putting stuff on page. But once it sort of lives on the page, it's out there in the world. And fair enough, all these ideas of copyright, but what was it the rest is history? These are such radically new concepts that the author would somehow, no, this was Pageau's and Roland's universal history, that once it's in a sense scripture. What do we mean by scripture? Well, it is written. Once it's there, it's sort of already sort of out there in space. And part of what modernity did was, again, sort of, grappling hooks on these things. And somehow your biological and or narrative ancestors are connected with this. You hold the rope. Hey, fair enough, given what's been done, but also it's kind of crazy.
Did you discuss this with the rabbi, the different ways that Christians and Jews look at the Hebrew scriptures?
Yeah, I think particularly when it comes, as you say, to Trinitarian readings, that was one area we discussed. And I think also, you can go to the Discord, you can Bridges of Meaning Discord, and you can have that conversation with Jacob. I had found the suffering servant in Isaiah, those suffering servant songs, a very significant part of my journey to a conviction that the scriptures had an integrated cohesion. That was one of the Isaiah 53, especially one of the scriptures, and so had quite a long discussion around alternative views on, as opposed to just presuming that definitively proved that a Messiah would suffer, which was not the expectation of the day. So certainly we had those conversations. I don't think, and I don't think I wouldn't be saying the text is so obvious, you can't reach any other conclusion as a thoughtful person. But I have come, and I think this is where it is slightly nebulous to say this, but I have just come to a place of peace that actually, when you do what you've done, Tom, which is to almost say, well, suspending my own personal convictions, let me read this text as though it is an integrated and sacred whole. When you take that kind of canonical reading, it's been my experience that it just coheres. It has sense and meaning. Now, I know that could be unpicked, but that's a personal experience.
Well, no, I completely agree. To read it with the sense that it has this power, that it's imbued with clues and meanings and that point to the entire explanation for the cosmos. I mean, that obviously makes the book incredibly more interesting to read. Of course it does.
See, this is a great example of why modernity is passing. Because first there's all the disclaimers. Well, personally, he was making that. Okay, who else are you speaking for? Now, I suppose if you're the Pope or, speaking for the Christian Reformed Church, I don't know if he's ordained in a particular church, but we always give that disclaimer. Well, we have this private-public thing that goes on, but then there's sort of a liberation that is happening out of modernity, and Tom Holland, again, I think he's just a uniquely courageous, honest human being who isn't afraid to stand up, and maybe the valence is different in the UK, but isn't afraid to stand up and say it's a lot more fun. So I'm gonna lose status for having fun. Maybe in your book, I don't give a rip, and it's interesting that think about the subtle weight of various tyrannies. There's a big piece of the Jordan Peterson moment, and so it's something thrilling and courageous to have someone like Tom Holland be so open about sharing this.
Because what could possibly be more thrilling than that? And that's why I say that I think
and again, back to Strange Rights. It's a whole lot more fun going to Rocky Horror Picture Show, dressing up, and yeah, I'm that old, and singing along. I remember I only went once, and I didn't dress up, and I didn't sing along, but I was in college, and my friends are, well, let's go here. And it's like, we always went to midnight movies. They were cheap, and we're college students. We stayed up late, and so go to this movie, and I was, what on earth is going on? But yeah, it's fun. My son Jared and I, the conclusion for Curse of Oak Island is coming up this week. Well, it actually aired already. Don't say anything in the comments. Don't spoil anything. They're probably not going to find anything. But, it's a thing that we do. And, Strange Rights, this is performative. It's sacred. This is how, in a sense, we make things sacred. And again, can we take this serious? Okay, but now back to the physical and the narrative.
That kind of Borgesian sense, the idea that
I don't know what he's saying there. So let me know in the comments section.
Library can perhaps contain the entire universe, or the entire universe can be contained within a library. It's such a kind of remarkable fantasy, and yet to realize that Borges was drawing on that on the writings of the Church Fathers, and the Church Fathers literally believed this, and they writers of such sophistication and power and scholarship, why not read it in that light?
Having a front row seat to the new Eastern Orthodox hotness and its invasion of North America. It's an astounding thing that these church fathers are, Augustine, James K. Smith and Augustine, of course, my friend Eric, on Twitter is always tweeting Augustine or Chrysostom. And of course, how many people on the Bridges of Meaning Discord are reading Church Fathers and, Heretic Sam and Protestant turned Catholic Hank, my friends over on Sam's channel, doing conversations about Church Fathers. This is not arbitrary.
It essentially, it's the only text that someone from my cultural background could do that. I can't look at the Aeneid and kind of choose bits at random and think that the gods are genuinely giving me a guide to the future. But culturally, I can read the Bible and I can open myself up to the possibility that this is more than just an assemblage of texts from specific periods.
But I can,
I've been watching. I tried to get my wife to watch Vikings with me. That didn't go well. But I've been watching The Last Kingdom, and I don't like it anywhere near as much as I liked Vikings. But again, it was going to have to do a commentary on that universal history, because they were talking about the Norse and, in a sense, how Odin and Thor didn't originate with the Norse. Odin and Thor took them over. Well, why did Christianity win? I mean, those questions, those questions are not arbitrary, incidental, or accidental. Why did Christianity win? Now, you get to play along right now, here and now, because, okay, I'll play the Arminian. You get to choose what to believe, if you think our agency is quite that simple. Will the God of Christianity lose the West? Islam conquered a lot of the Eastern Empire. See, the thing is, these histories are told in centuries, and we live these tiny little lives, but we get to play. And Tom Holland, who writes these, it's like, part of what's so fun about Tom's books is the way he writes history. And so to have him seduced by church fathers shouldn't be a surprise. Because once you fall in love, you want to play along.
imagine that the skeptic coming back immediately to that, Tom, and saying, well, of course you can, because the Bible has shaped the world you live in, as you so well, have established in your own work. So are you simply reading yourself back into a text that has shaped you, and it's a sort of vicious circle in that
the modernist comes back
sense? And if you had been raised,
not that I'm saying Justin is a modernist, but the modernist voice, that's what he's voicing. Because there's the idea that, well, I can somehow have this certainty based on. Now, Holland is a historian, so he knows just how tenuous the physical data is from the past and how ensconced it is. But Justin saying, but if you're going to need reasons, you're going to need to deal with that data. And
I don't know, in Arabia, then the Quran would somehow magically explain the world to you in a remarkably coherent way.
And so what I'm going to do is imagine me being not me, and that this is again the monarchical vision. So what happens with science is that you cover one eye and you say, okay, I'm going to take out all personal agency and I'm going to do this in the lab. And, well, that idea escaped the lab. And so the monarchical vision spread all over the place like a virus. Gosh, if we'd only have a story that could imagine that. And spreads all over the world like a virus. And so we start doing it in all different ways. Imagine I was Shirley Temple. I can sort of try. I could read a biography. And that kind of substitution is very natural to us. But can I really do it? I'll never be Shirley Temple.
So essentially, I have to let off the safety lock because of course I do have all kinds of questions
Metaphorical truth.
about how these texts came to be compiled. I know that there are all kinds of various versions. I know I've read all the biblical criticism, and I know that it's immeasurably complicated, far too complicated for me, from my amateur perspective, possibly.
He said that a lot to me in our little conversation. And someone might look at me and say, well, you're not an amateur. No, I am. Well, how about Tom Wright? I think if you ask Tom Wright, he can't read everything. This stuff is too much for any of us to know in the way that we all pretended in modernity to know stuff. Can't be done. You don't have enough time in your life. What does that mean? Now we're back to Petersonian. You have to act. To act is to decide. And at some point, you just have to jump. And we have this all the time in our lives. Any decision we make. And again, this is where when they have these split brain experiments, and some poor person didn't feel any emotion because of how they had to adjust his brain. And you think, well, he would be Spock-like. And the answer was he couldn't make a decision because at some point, the rest of the consciousness Congress, which is sort of feeding the emotional, the one that's moving your mouth, says, go there, do that. And we're not always right. We're human beings. But at some point, you do, and you go, and you pay the consequence, and you participate in the game, and you live. That's what life is.
To engage with. But I'm also aware that in a sense, to worry about that is to position myself within a particular cultural framework, a particular temporal framework, and that there are other periods of history which have looked at this book where there have been very different perspectives. And I am not so confident now that the perspective of the 21st century is necessarily correct. I think it's one of multiple perspectives. And
plurality has borne interesting fruit.
I guess it's kind of about avoiding the enormous condescension of posterity. It's about going back and looking at what, the reformers in the 16th century or the...
Well, and dare we say, you heard Bishop Barron not say, hey, postmodernity is all wrong. And you hear James K. Smith say, hey, postmodernity isn't all wrong. And Peterson has sort of, made a scarecrow out of postmodernity. But Jordan Peterson is plenty postmodern himself, even though he's advocating for modernity in a certain way. But I look at him and think, you don't get here without it. And in some ways, a guy like, my first conversation with Jonathan Peugeot, drag the guy's story out of him because I want to know who I'm talking to. So I'm going to drag your story out of you. That's what pastors do. I'll meet you and shake your hands in back of the service. But if for some reason I think you're a person I'm going to have to deal with, I'm going to drag your story out of you because I want to know what kind of person's on the other side of the table. And you should look at Jonathan Peugeot's story. Through modernity, into postmodernity, all the way to Africa. And it's like, no, I need something real. And hey, I may be wrong, but I'm not going to be internally divided because that doesn't get you anything.
The great, the enormous condescension of posterity. It's about going back and looking at what, the reformers in the 16th century or the great theologians of the Middle Ages or the Church Fathers or Paul said about Scripture, and recognizing that if I kind of if I open my mind to them and kind of lie back, tune in, don't worry, then there are truths and understandings and perspectives, and definitely, as Andrew said, it makes the biblical texts much more interesting.
Yes. I suppose the same question for you then, Andrew. Why this text? Why this story? Why, in a sense, you were raised in it. You were raised in a culture that was, founded on the Judeo-Christian thinking. But today, I know there's a popular podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Literally, the presenters sit down and treat the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling like the Bible and say, we're going to read from the Epistle of whatever and draw out spiritual life lessons. And to that extent, I can imagine the person who says it's useful, but it's useful because it's appropriate to you. The person who gets a lot out of Harry Potter or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever, that's just the way we do life. We get our narratives, our meanings from whatever our culture hands to us as being most meaningful.
And it's exactly at this point that the Peugeot stuff starts to grip. Someone put in the comment section, Justin, when are you going to have Peugeot on? Yeah, good question. Who are you going to have them with? That's going to be interesting because and this is what Justin does so well, so fairly. He doesn't straw man. He says, here's the question of arbitrary. Is any other thing good enough? Now, you've got the historical answer and say, well, actually people have tried lots of different things. And why this one has endured, the Lindy effect, Nassim Taleb's arguments, they are a piece of this. But this is where Peugeot comes and says, no, there's all kinds of patterns. And the reason this story has conquered and works and is enduring and still with us is because the confirmation is not in the heel print of Jesus of Nazareth right outside of the tomb. It's because the confirmation is all over the place in terms of how life works. And that's it's very much C.S. Lewis's argument about antiquity and all of this. It's not arbitrary. And read his book Miracles.
Is that all the Bible is then, just another option? I know you're going to say no, but why not in your opinion?
Well, I think I'd agree with Tom in terms of what he said earlier, that actually, of course, that is culturally conditioned. I'm not trying to stand outside my own context and upbringing. But what I would say, in addition to that, is when it comes to Harry Potter, arguably you can see the Christian story playing itself out even within that story. So is there an archetypal story? Is there something that is underpinning all other great tales, whether fictional or non-fiction?
And this, of course, is where... So you have this turn to the sources. Again, that Universal History podcast was astounding that Peugeot was in. You have this turn to the text. And then, oh gosh, we've just blown up Northern Europe. What if we look at empiricism and reason? Maybe we can work that. Maybe we can get underneath the text with these things, and we get at certainty that way. And then postmodernity comes and says, "Nah, you're still looking through your own eyes to get there." And so Peterson says, "Okay, well then let's look at our eyes. Let's look at our filters." And so maybe it's these texts because this is the way filters are shaped. And now we're going to come to the question of, well, maybe it's human. And this is where again you come back to the fact that I can't answer for Shirley Temple. And I don't need to. Shirley Temple Black, God rest her soul, has been gone for a while. I need to answer for me. I live in a place, in a life, at a time, and I have to choose and I get to choose. And so we all judge each other. That's part of the data narrative thing. But tell me I can't. I lose status in your eyes because I don't answer it the way you'd have me answer it. Okay.
And the claim of the Bible is that, yes, it is. And I think the reason that I think is important to affirm a commitment to the Christian scriptures in the light of many other options is because the scriptures themselves are making universal claims. This is one of the things I think Tom's highlighted in his work, that part of what we've inherited in the Judeo-Christian worldview is a sense that the God who made a covenant with Abraham will bless all families through his offspring, and that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is the release of that blessing to all nations. And so the work of the Apostle Paul and others is as someone intent on bringing this message of Jesus, the risen Messiah, to the world, not just to a particular civilization. And in that sense, Christianity is fundamentally not Western in its origins, even if it's had a huge footprint in the West. I think, therefore, it doesn't stand or fall on any embedded culture that it's within. I think it stands or falls on, and this is where I would
see, and again, right here, what's he looking for? He's looking for a foundation. And, well, history, and that's where Peterson comes along, and Peterson says, no, it's standing or falling on psychology. Psychology? That's only 100 years old. Well, Augustine, Plato, but well, what about the resurrection? Peterson, but psychology, Darwin proves Christianity right. People have been working on that chestnut for 150 years.
Push harder on, is there a correspondence fundamentally between, if you like, the map of the Bible and the metaphysical realities of life? And that's my own conviction, that there is a correspondence, and that it's not just that the map has some really, the Bible isn't just that it has some very powerful ideas and ideals, but that it actually corresponds.
Give us one example, just to put a bit of meat on that. What sort of thing the Bible says maps with the metaphysical reality in a way that isn't just a coincidence, in a sense, for you?
Well,
so again, we're all right, what narrative are we pushing against? The world is arbitrary, and I'm going to have to talk to John Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau about the problem of evil, and it's like, oh gosh. And one answer is, well, all of the evil and suffering, we sort of want to believe that the world is arbitrary. But then with all the good and beauty, we sort of want to believe that it isn't. We can't get away from ourselves.
Well, I think going right back to the beginning, if the claim right at the beginning of the origin story, which I think is absolutely remarkable, and I've appreciated Dominion with this in mind, it's remarkable to say in such an ancient culture that humans, male and female, are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, for me, the question then is that simply a social construct? Is that something that has arisen?
This is where Glenn Scrivener had it pretty bad. Gave Matt Dillahunty a pretty good beatdown.
As a way of honouring and thinking of dignity and the sacred value of humanity, and without going into the details of which particular theory of creation or evolution you adhere to, is there nevertheless some divine being who is superintending the whole process of human origin such that we are actually made in the likeness and image of God?
Some divine being, God number 2.
And therefore, when you model that and affirm that, it resonates deeply with the human condition, and that human condition is transcultural. So whichever nationality or context or historical moment you are born and raised in, the human condition hasn't fundamentally changed. The map that says we're made in the image and likeness of God corresponds to the landscape of what you see when you hold a child in your arms that's a newborn, and what happens when you say goodbye to a loved one for the last time. It deeply resonates that's actually true. And then at the other end of the story, I think, I'll pause there. Sorry, Justin. You
go. Just be interested. Yeah, but hopefully we'll have time for another one. But that's an interesting.
Come on, Justin. You've heard of Joe Rogan. Go there.
Specific there, Tom. One that you obviously have referenced in your own work. So, is that? Do you see that as a kind of a coherence, a mapping on of the story of the Bible to a metaphysical reality? Because or is it that story shaped the way we think about? You'd like it to,
and for good reason. We want hope. I mean, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon rose because of the success of the nihilistic story. There is no narrative. You're just imposing a narrative on the world. And you begin to realize the horror of that. Because again, you can't live without one. You really can't.
Because it's a huge reassurance, isn't it? I mean, we're so saturated in that assumption that there is an inherent human dignity that I think we are naturally prone to assume that it must map onto kind of metaphysical objective truth. And even those who I mean, in the very name humanist, there's an idea that to be human has a kind of dignity, even if that is, humanists are rejecting the idea that Scripture is somehow God-given or God-inspired. But I mean, I think that there is, of course, this incredible power within the Bible, this assurance that humans do have that dignity, do have that status. But I would say that that there are other myths and other texts that perhaps provide a kind of alternative perspective, of which the Greek myths would be for us in the West the other great cultural influence. That actually awful things happen and people just go down to the underworld and there isn't really any plan and there isn't really any dignity. And the only dignity to be had is to kind of stare down the fact that there isn't any dignity.
And that's sort of what a lot of people are offering. Sam Harris, that's the thrill of looking into the abyss. Okay, that's actually just sort of pride. And, well, pride doesn't necessarily map out very well through your whole life.
And that, in a way, is a kind of crueler, more unsettling possibility. And I think that, I think it's fascinating. And I realize that I've always been haunted by this kind of symbiosis between the two great mythic accounts in our culture that we have in the West of a city being stormed and torched. For the Greeks, of course, it's Troy and the portrayals of the Trojan War, not just in Homer, but in tragedy, counterpointed to the portrayal of the sacking of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and everything that follows from that. And there is the kind of promise of hope and redemption.
What about the sacking of Rome and Augustine's city of God? I think that one comes next in line.
And perhaps it's not surprising that by and large we want to cling to the hope that there's redemption rather than the fact that it's just dogs eating discarded babies.
I suppose it's that whole question though of yes, whether the story is pointing to a metaphysical reality. In a sense, as you've made the point in many of your works, Tom, and writings, the humanists who want it just to be a materialist universe and so on, they've got their story certainly doesn't come from the science, of the thing that doesn't tell us that we have a human dignity or anything. Right. As far as you can see, they are as fully wedded to the Christian story as you and I are. In that sense.
Yes, because you could just as easily end up as a Nazi as a liberal if you jettison. If you're just going with the science.
I think when Tom references the sacking of Jerusalem as well, I think that's a good instance of the Bible actually capturing a story, a narrative that is incredibly difficult. I mean, the theme of exile, it arguably runs through the whole Bible because it's the estrangement of our human condition in the world. But Israel experiences it in a very historical moment. And the reason I find that helpful is that actually this is both hard and helpful. It's actually clearly the prophets understand that this event of exile has been caused by God, even Israel's God, even though outworked through foreign powers. But then it's within that context of exile that this amazing verse in Jeremiah that I think is with my Bible Society hat on, I think it's becoming one of possibly the most popular verse in the Bible now, that I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future, is written and spoken into the context of defeat, exile, despair. And I think that's right at the heart of what we're discussing today, actually, is fundamentally, is that story a redemptive story, a story of hope? Is that the true story?
I mean, one thought on that. The Trojan War, if it ever happened, is essentially a myth. We know nothing about really what happened. These are mythical figures. We don't know what happened to the people who fought at Troy. We don't even know if they did fight at Troy.
Listen to the rest of his history on Troy. I think there's 2 of them on there. It's great podcast.
The thing about the people from Jerusalem being carried to Babylon and then returning, and the people who've been left behind staying true to their God in the face of overwhelming defeat, that is a historical fact. So there was something in the scripture and in the relationship of the people who read that scripture to the God that they found vested in that scripture that did enable the survivors of the Babylonian sack to retain an identity. And that's unique. No other group of exiles, including the 10 tribes of Israel that got taken to Assyria, were able to do that. So
that's a very Petersonian argument. The proof of validity through history is in history itself.
That in itself is a fascinating kind of contrast, I think, and perhaps again suggests why people by and large have been happier to identify with suffering Jerusalem than with suffering Troy.
I'd still say,
and both Troy and Jerusalem are the losers.
I'd still say, even whilst those examples are helpful, I think the sharp edge of this issue of does the map correspond to the metaphysical reality, I suppose from a Christian perspective, the sharp edge of that is the resurrection of Jesus ultimately, isn't it? That is the point within the story. You could, to some degree, you could dispense with all other, to a differing degree, dispense with all other, but on that one there seems to be this this tethering of the map and the landscape, the historical event and the story that's crucial. And I think that's probably the one where the decision needs to be made clearest.
And that's a nice cliffhanger.
Something else.
Can we go to a cliffhanger, Tom? Because I'm just going to take a quick break. On that cliffhanger about the Bible, can it make
United Kingdom just who is claiming he's a morally godlike?
Can the Bible make sense of? And Tom Holland, that's available now, which he's been on. But we've also mentioned in the course of the show Revolutionary, a recent go. Tom, I want to hear what you're working on at the moment. But I did leave us on a cliffhanger, which is Andrew saying if there's one event that really is at the sharp edge of whether the Bible story is tethered to reality, to metaphysical reality, it is this claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And you wanted to say something in response, so go ahead with your thought, and we'll start to draw things
yes,
together.
I did. So in my kind of lazy skeptic phase, where the only things I ever read about the Bible were kind of deconstructions of it, the fact that there are 4 gospel accounts and they don't necessarily agree, and then you've got Paul's letters, and he barely references the life of Jesus, and that it all seems a terrible muddle and no one can entirely agree, and that's is advanced as evidence for something lacking at the heart of the New Testament. I now think that actually it's that uncertainty that lies at the heart, the positive message, because basically it's saying something so weird happened, something so odd that we can't really frame it. So we here are 4 accounts of it. And they're all different because nobody can actually get a grip on it. And if you look at Paul, one of the things that most turned me off Christianity was Paul, and having to sit as a child and listen to his epistles to the apostles.
Now that's Paul of Tarsus, not Paul of Sacramento.
Oh God, no. When I sat down and I read them, trying to work out what he was saying, and realised that he's thinking aloud. He's wrestling with something so bizarre and so odd that that language is inadequate to frame the kind of ideas that he's wrestling with, and his mind is inadequate to cope with the kind of the drama of what has been revealed to him. That makes it incredibly powerful. And actually, it's certainly with the New Testament, it's the uncertainty and the strangeness of it that actually seems to me to suggest that these are people who are writing about something that they certainly think is just beyond weird.
They didn't cook it up. They didn't get their story straight. it's a mess, just like most real things.
And it's the weirdness of it, it's the strangeness, it's the inability to merge these kind of different accounts that to me actually shows that there must be something strange going on there.
Strange, strange enough to be believable in a sense, I suppose. And again, I'm asking a personal question here, Tom, but do
He's not very nice. Let poor Tom have his process.
do you feel like you're at a place where you can say,
Evangelicals, they're just so pushy.
I think there's enough here for me to sort of take that forward, make a commitment of faith in that,
Bishop Barron won't do this. I won't do this.
to that kind of an idea that,
Sometimes, definitely at Easter, definitely at Christmas, definitely at certain times and at certain places, and over the past year with the attempt to make sense of everything that's happened. I found that it makes sense in the most total, the most complete way of any metaphysics
Right.
that I can engage with. But and I talked to you about this before, Justin, that there are always,
And you just keep poking there, Justin, huh? You and Scrivener. Scrivener, I was embarrassed for him when I watched his videos with Tom Holland.
these kind of moments where suddenly there's a kind of bucket of cold water comes, and I guess that it's looking at the Bible, which, since that's what we're talking about, is it a rabbit or a duck? It can be both simultaneously, and there are times where I look at the Bible and I think, is this, as Origen said, is this a great mansion full of many rooms with different keys, and I could find the keys? Wow. Or is this a compilation of texts that were written by people that have been misinterpreted, that have been stitched together? And then I think, yeah, of course, that's what it is. And it's the question of, can I merge those two so that I can keep them both in my brain at the same time? And it's a kind of ongoing thing. So there are times where I can say, yes, I surrender to the power of this.
And again, that's me too. Paul Vanderklay, you're a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. You made profession of faith when you were just after your 12th grade graduation. You've very seldom missed a Sunday. You lead Bible studies. You have a YouTube channel. You're the pastor of the intellectual dark web. Yeah, but I'm here and I'm thinking out loud because and I'm paying attention to Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, and I've been a big fan of Unbelievable for a very long time because, is it a rabbit or a duck? What does he mean? It's that optical illusion thing. And it's kind of a neat illustration because it's sort of a gestalt. But yet, why, on my last question and answer, I was asked what would bring me to lose my faith, and I again expressed why, at least to the degree that I know why. To what degree do we know why we do anything? It's far more tenuous than we would like to admit, but yeah.
And then there are other times where I think, no. So it's a yes and no.
It's an interesting,
I'm aware that's an unsatisfactory answer.
It's not unsatisfactory. It's honest. It's truthful. And, as a pastor who talks to people, not just here in Sacramento, but now people all over the world, this is faith. This is faith. Hebrews 11. We're reaching out for what we do not see. We do not have it yet.
in the least, because in a way, I think you've put your finger on sort of where that junction comes between sort of living into something rather than simply looking at it from the outside. And in a way, Andrew, in a way, the whole point of your book is about stepping into this story, right? And that's often the bit where faith comes in, as far as I'm concerned. You can have wonderful apologetics and theology about the Bible story and whether it's reliable and everything else and putting it together. But I suppose the real challenge is it the kind of story that you can literally step into and see yourself as part of a grand narrative? And that's your claim, is
not just see yourself as, but live it, do it. Because you can't live in Harry Potter's world. You can't live in Star Wars. I mean, you can dress up and get a fake lightsaber, and you can walk around thinking you're Gandalf maybe, but this is the world you can live in.
Is that you can and you should, I suppose, in this book, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's a fairer summary. I think it's almost, to use an analogy, it's almost like if you go to a clothes shop and you try something on in their changing room. You're giving it a try. You're seeing does this fit me? But there does come a point where you then have to say, I like this. It fits. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to buy into it. And I think Christianity ultimately still has that going to the counter and buying it, doesn't it? Moment and it's an act of faith. And I don't think for a moment that.
So Justin Brierley's the annoying customer service representative. Do you want it? Are you going to get it? Or do you have your credit card ready?
Precludes doubt, just as Tom was articulating it. But I do think that when you buy into this story, it just deeply resonates with who we are as human beings. I come back to what I said. I think Ordnance Surveys sell a lot of maps and do a great job precisely because they work for the landscape. They make sense. They help you navigate. And
his first degree as a geographer coming to be used at this moment of altar call. There is a God.
I think the resurrection of Jesus in that sense is less a historical fact that has to be coldly proved, and more, I saw this Easter actually, The Spectator had a sort of front cover. On their front cover, it was sort of a view out of the empty tomb with a sort of sunrise breaking. And I just thought it was, given all that our world's going through, it was a beautiful visual of capturing the fact that actually the Easter story is fundamentally a story of hope. And we need that. And so I do believe that Jesus physically rose from death. I've actually grown in my conviction of that through reading Dominion, because I just think that the scale of the transformation that Christianity...
And that's an illustration of the whole business about... I mean, once Tom Holland put this out into the world, it lives. And it got a lot of Tom Holland in it, but it's not quite tethered to him.
Broad, almost begs for a cause to match the effect. The scale of the effect is so considerable against all of the odds. And other failed attempts, Judas of Galilee and others, failed attempts to bring about some kind of messianic, movement, indicate that at the point that the body of Jesus of Nazareth was laid in the tomb, Christianity was over. Nothing comes from nothing, and it was reduced to death. And so I just think resurrection I think it's a metaphysical reality. I think that Jesus rose from death. But I also think that when you see in the course of...
It's a metaphysical reality. It's a physical reality. The most true things are most true at all levels, and they go out from there.
Christian history, and still today, what that hope can do for people, what it does for those who are struggling with illness and sickness that won't go away, what it does for those who are struggling with bereavement, and there's been a lot of that as COVID has ravaged our world. I just think that hope, exactly as you said, we can try it on and realize that it fits.
And as a pastor, hey, it still works. Lots of things will work that don't work that well and don't work that often and don't work that long. You can hug and sing a Kenny Rogers song, and that might just work for you and your sister who grew up listening to that, but it won't scale. The most real things are most real, and they explode out and create the universe.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much, both of you. Such an interesting conversation today on the show. There are more conversations to come, especially actually with Tom Holland. Holland. You can see him sitting down with N.T. Wright, no less, at this year's Unbelievable conference to have similar kinds of conversations. With
Excited.
kind of taking it to the next level. We've agreed in a way, the way that the Bible has, impacted the modern world, but can it still? And how do we take that message to a new generation? That's really our theme at this year's Unbelievable conference. So do join myself, Tom Holland, Tom Wright, and other speakers who will be with us there. Unbelievable.live for Saturday the 15th of May. And you'll both want to watch this as well. 2 days beforehand, Andrew and Tom, guess who I've got with N.T. Wright for a special conversation rather like this one? None other than the associate editor of The Spectator, Douglas Murray. So
Excited about that. Not as excited as Esther, but very excited still. I'll definitely watch that. And if I find enough stuff in it, might give it the full treatment like this one. This conversation deserved the full treatment.
We're going to be getting Douglas and Tom together to talk through these kinds of issues.
I want to see Tom Holland and Douglas Murray talk. And Justin can do fine with that. Justin's the best at this. He really is. Anyway, so I wanted to get that little commercial in anyway. So yeah, I should probably take this screenshot. Now you can see how it's made. That's a good screenshot. It's a good picture of all of them. Yeah. I should pause. You don't need to. All right, I'll try to be a better YouTuber. Anyway, thank you for watching. I don't know how long this was. I'll find out in a minute. But this was awesome. And I can't believe it took me a week to do this, but I do believe in God's timing with this stuff. And I'm still itchy to really dig into the Peugeot Roland conversation, and I hope those two do more. And I said on Twitter, I want to have Tom Holland do a commentary video on the universal history of Peugeot, and because they got into Troy, they got into Constantine, they got into, so that's just really cool. Anyway, thanks for watching. Leave a comment.